Uh, so greetings, everyone. I'm pulling up my screen, and of course, uh, there we go. Okay, share that. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Great, and I will put it into do you remember where do you do the
You were right. View and then slideshow. Two
slideshow?
down.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right. Well, greetings, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining this dialogue in the design school for regenerating Earth. This is focused on bioregional carrying capacity measurement and management. I'm Bill Bowie. I'm senior director with r3.0, which stands for Redesign for Resilience and Regeneration. And this is actually a session that has been sort of in the makings for a while. So we started some background conversation about this between Penny, Joe, and me, and also looped in Claire and Brandon along the line. And so this is potentially, this is a conversation about carrying capacities in a bioregional context. And so this is sort of an introductory session. But I'm very open to this, depending on the level of interest. If this becomes a series, there are certainly other elements that we could talk about, or we could go into much more depth around this. So this is really intended to be an introductory session. And since this is, since we're in the design school, this is a sort of a friendly atmosphere. I'm totally open to answering questions as we go. So if folks do have a question, just raise your hand with the with the computer, with the Zoom icon, and then I'll be able to see it in the sidebar. And Penny, maybe you could help me with that in case I don't see folks who are raising a hand.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this again is just sort of an introduction to the idea of carrying capacities at the bioregional scale. So I'm going to dive right in. And we often like to think of carrying capacity as donuts and pie slices. And that's just to kind of wrap your head around it with a whimsical visualization. You'll understand more about why we're using these terms as we go along. But just if you think donuts as thresholds or limits, if you will, and pie slices as allocations or a proportionate share, a fair slice of the pie is a term that you will often hear. And so those are the two key concepts in terms of looking at carrying capacity and applying it at a bioregional level. And I should say carrying capacities, not just a singular thing. But I wanted to start with Dana Meadows, who is really kind of a hero of mine. And also I see myself very much working in a kind of direct lineage from Dana, which I'll share a little bit more about in a little bit. But she really, in her 1982 essay that many of you know, called The History of the Ideas Underlying the Balaton Group, which is really the introduction of the idea of bioregional learning centers. She said, it's this quote that's a sort of a mashup of different things that she says in that paper that really kind of encapsulates what I'm talking about today. And that's, she says, I see an interaction between the resource endowment of a particular area and its cultural endowment. So there we have sort of bioregionalism at its core, a geographical terrain and a terrain of consciousness, as Peter Bird called it. So she sees that interaction underpinning the need to collect, make sense of, and disseminate information about the resources of the bioregions and about the welfare of the people and of the ecosystems, including ways to quantify and communicate the concept of carrying capacity. So that's what we're doing today, is in particular taking the idea of carrying capacity and applying it at the bioregional level. So most of what we're going to discuss today is on the carrying capacity side of things. So just wanted to start things out with just a brief definition. So this is from the book that many of you are probably familiar with. I know Joe is a big fan of it, and Overshoot by William Catton that came out in 1980. And on the very cover, he defines carrying capacity as the maximum permanently supportable load. And the cascading implications of this is that overshoot is growth beyond carrying capacity, which leads to crash or die off or collapse, as we often use the term. So these are some of the key concepts that we'll be working with today. Carrying capacity is the maximum permanently supportable load, but also later in this session, we'll also hear that it's sort of the minimum amount of resources needed to live in a state of well-being. So that's sort of a counterbalancing definition of carrying capacity. But I just wanted to start off with a very basic definition here. Going into sort of a long history of carrying capacity. On the left, we have carrying capacity as it's been respected by indigenous cultures for millennia. And this is a graphic from Lila June Johnston's doctoral dissertation, Architects of Abundance, Indigenous Regenerative Food and Land Management Systems and the Excavation of Hidden History, that came out 2 years ago. And what she demonstrates in that dissertation is that indigenous communities managed their food systems and land systems over millennia. So she looks at the archaeological evidence to show how indigenous communities did this. So for example, one sort of cycle that she points to is the human use of fire that would nourish the canebrake ecosystems that would then nourish the buffalo, and that the buffalo would then nourish the human beings in this sort of regenerative cycle that led to the sustainability of those systems over long periods of time, because they were operating dynamically, balancing their carrying capacity. There weren't too many buffalo, there weren't too many humans, and they were being nourished in a balanced way. You compare this with the average lifespan of 336 years for Western civilizations. This is research by Luke Kemp that is graphically represented in a BBC article, and you can see that Western civilizations have a growth overshoot collapse dynamics baked into them, at least according to the research that we have. In fact, there is no Western civilization that has actually sustained itself over a significant period of time. That all Western civilizations have in fact collapsed. So that's part of the DNA, if you will. And many of them collapse, if not all, because of transgressing their carrying capacity of their resources. So that's just a bit of history. Doing a little bit more grounding in the deeper past before bringing us closer to the present. So even Plato, in his Book of Laws, Book 5, he talks about a suitable total for the number of citizens cannot be fixed without considering the land and the neighboring states. The land must be extensive enough to support a given number of people in modest comfort, and not a foot more is needed. So in essence, you could consider that a definition of carrying capacity before the term carrying capacity came about. And that's the next thing that we're going to look at is the question of the term carrying capacity And so this is from a paper that came out, an academic paper that came out in 2008 by Sayer, Nathan Sayer, and it looks at the genesis, history, and limits of the term carrying capacity. And so he looked at it and found that the first use of the term carrying capacity was in 1845 from a report by the United States Secretary of State to the Senate. And it talks about changes and modifications in the commercial systems of foreign nations. And you can see that's the letter itself. I did a little bit of research and found the letter itself with the use of the term carrying capacity. And what it had to do with was the shift from sailboats to steamships. And in particular, there were taxing or tariffs put onto ships based on the capacity of the commercial cargo that they could haul, which, on a sailing ship, there isn't too much space that is taken up by the machinery that would be needed for, say, a steamship. So in this transition, the political transition went from taxing a ship based on its overall cargo area to, in steamships, taking into account the fact that there was much more limited cargo space because of the huge amount of machinery that was needed to run a steamship. And so essentially carrying capacity came about when thinking, well, how do we tax this this cargo? So that was the genesis, literally the genesis of the term carrying capacity. So another illustration of it also comes from a maritime metaphor, if you will, and that's the Plimsoll line. And this image, the below image, was, we'd been talking about the notion of carrying capacity and thresholds for many, many years. And one of our folks that we encountered a lot, Tjeerd Krumpelman from ABN AMRO, a bank in the Netherlands, said, it was when I saw this picture that I finally understood the concept of carrying capacity. And the Plimsoll line is something that came about in the later in the 1870s, when in the UK in particular, it's where Samuel Plimsoll was based, and he was in Parliament there. And there was a dynamic where merchants would overload the ships both with cargo that was commercial cargo and with insurance. So many of these ships would get halfway across the Atlantic and sink. But from a financial perspective, it was still profitable because the insurance was was essentially worth more than what was on the ship. So it was, from a business perspective, it was an efficient process. And this horrified Samuel Plimsoll. And so he was behind legislation that went through the Parliament in 1876 that called for putting one of these Plimsoll lines on the side of cargo ships that shows these various different levels that at different circumstances, like tropical versus freshwater, summer versus winter. But basically that the ship, the water line had to be below or equal to that Plimsoll line. Otherwise, the ship would sink. And so that's the idea of carrying capacity, is really that a system will sink if it's not respecting its carrying capacity. So that's sort of the conceptual foundations of this term. The term itself really came into prominence in 1972 with the publication of the Limits to Growth report, which was lead authored by Dana Meadows, who we met earlier on the second slide. And in that book, you see that the top graphic shows carrying capacity of a population over time. And as you can see, that population can grow, but if it maintains respect for the carrying capacity, in other words, the resources that are needed to sustain that population, then everything is good. However, when the population grows to transgress that carrying capacity, it leads to what the authors of Limits to Growth called overshoot and collapse. So that is a literal phrase that they used 5 times in Limits to Growth. So it isn't just that you overshoot your carrying capacity, it's that whenever you overshoot your carrying capacity, collapse is the inevitable outcome. Collapse both of the population or the resource that's required to sustain the population and the carrying capacity. So this is important to see that the idea of carrying capacity and overshoot and collapse are really dynamically interlinked together. So still in the Limits to Growth, this is the famous figure 35. So this is the standard run of the World 3 model. World 3 is a computer model that the Limits to Growth team used out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was developed there for use in this report, in this study. And the standard run is just assuming that the conditions, the sort of business as usual continued on from 1972 when the report was written through into the future. So you see this is extrapolated out to 2100. And this is a sort of a revised version of this that just, it's the same thing that showed up in 1972. It's just made color and shows today's date approximately. This was made a couple of years ago. But what it shows is that we are on the cusp of the collapse that had been described by Limits to Growth, where we have rising pollution, rising industrial output, rising food, rising population. Meanwhile, the resources are slowly declining throughout the entire period. And that leads to, as you can see, a number of collapses on the right-hand side of this graphic. And so it's this figure 35 that demonstrates the dynamic of overshoot and collapse most readily. Now, in 1972, these were just projections. They were not predictions. They were not saying this is what will happen. They were projections that said if we follow various scenarios, and this was the scenario that was sort of didn't introduce major changes, this is what will likely happen. That this is what is projected to happen. And the Gaia Harrington has recently done a study that looked at the original projections, compared them to the actual data, and found that figure 35 was incredibly prescient, that we are essentially tracking that almost precisely. So that's background from the Limits to Growth. We'll fast forward a little bit back to 1998. Where Dana said this, which I think really kind of encapsulates our approach to sustainability measurement, which is that sustainability indicators should be related to carrying capacity or to threshold of dangers. So those two terms we use interchangeably, carrying capacity and threshold. So here's the important thing. She says tons of nutrient, and that's phosphorus or nitrogen from fertilizer, for example, that tons of nutrient per year released into waterways means nothing to people. So if you release a ton, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that unsustainable? Is it sustainable? We don't know. The only way that we know is when we look at the amount that's released relative to the amount that waterways can absorb without becoming toxic or clogged. That begins to carry a message. And actually, we would say that is the message, essentially. Are you operating within your carrying capacity? A couple of years after the Limits to Growth, the United Nations released this Cocoyoc Declaration that was named after the Mexican town where this United Nations meeting took place. And Barbara Ward is a famous British economist and environmentalist who was the rapporteur. So she wrote up the findings of this particular conference. And what they found was, or what they articulated, is that it has proved impossible to meet the inner limit of satisfying fundamental human needs. On the contrary, more people are hungry, sick, shelterless, and illiterate today than when the United Nations was first set up. At the same time, new and unforeseen concerns have begun to darken the international prospects. Environmental degradation and the rising pressure on resources raise the question whether the outer limits of the planet's physical integrity may not be at risk. Now, what's important here is that Ward suggests that there are outer limits to the sort of biosphere integrity. There are outer limits to what the biosphere can handle in terms of impacts upon it and still be resilient and still provide for the needs of life forms in that biosphere. At the same time, there are inner limits. So there are minimums for the viability of life. And so it's this connection of inner and outer that we'll come back to shortly, but that's an important concept, that carrying capacity isn't just the maximum, it also includes notions of minimums. So we're going to go back to overshoot to William Catton to show his graphics on carrying capacity. And you can see here the first, the upper left is a projection of a population existing within its carrying capacity. And then it's on the lower right, where it not only has the population and the carrying capacity is the dotted line on the bottom, but the notion of temporary carrying capacity. So that's the dash and dotted line in the lower right-hand panel D. And what Catton says is the lesson from panel D is that crash caused by the exhaustion of phantom carrying capacity by Homo colossus, or human beings that are living too large, so to speak, could preclude a later cycle of regrowth. So the point that the key point here is the notion of temporary carrying capacity, or what he calls phantom carrying capacity. So that's the dynamic where even when a population transgresses its carrying capacity, the collapse isn't immediate. So you can exist on phantom carrying capacity, which is essentially the buffers that are baked into a system, or importing carrying capacity from elsewhere, for example. These are sort of the examples that Catton gives. And so this notion of phantom carrying capacity or temporary carrying capacity is very important, as you'll see in the next slide, which this is from the Global Footprint Network, and this is a measure of the ecological footprint. So this is a concept that was introduced in the 1990s, where it said, well, hey, what is the footprint of humanity on our ecology? And in particular, the question that the ecological footprint answers is, are we living within our biocapacity, as they called it, William Rees and Mathis Swakernagel? And so they created a methodology, and in the 90s, they looked at historical data to identify, well, is humanity living within its carrying capacity? And what they found was that humanity first entered into what they called Earth overshoot, or transgressing our carrying capacity, on December 25th of 1971. So literally right as Limits to Growth was in press, when it was going to publication, and the concept of overshoot and collapse was being articulated in a broad scale way, simultaneously humanity was literally moving into overshoot and collapse. And so we've been existing, as you can see here in the graphic, we have been getting overshooter and overshooter throughout this entire historical period. So we've been living off of phantom carrying capacity for more than a half century. And as you can see, the red line is the sort of business as usual. If we continued doing that, we would just get overshooter and overshooter. But even the green line in this graphic shows that we're still in overshoot, even if we get to that green line of using only 1.5 Earths. We have to get down into our carrying capacity so that we're no longer in overshoot. And so thereby stop existing on phantom carrying capacity, which the definition here is it's either the illusory or the extremely precarious capacity of an environment to support a given life form or a given way of living. Another view of the ecological footprint, this is just the same information, just a little bit more updated and a different visualization that just sort of clearly demonstrates that we've been in Earth overshoot throughout almost my entire lifetime. Essentially, I'm 56 years old, so a little bit more than my entire lifetime. But the other thing that the ecological footprint methodology introduced, and this is an important element, we've been talking about threshold up until this point. We haven't talked yet about, well, how do you downscale that to something smaller than the entire system? And that calls for what you would call allocation. Or a fair Earth share is what they called it in the ecological footprint. So a fair Earth share for every human on Earth is about 4.2 acres. So every human would need about 4.2 acres in order to sustain itself. The reproductive capacity of that acreage. So this was a very important concept because you can't apply thresholds at something like an organization without this idea of allocation or how do you downscale it to something lesser than the entire system. So this is an example of how to allocate water. So this is just conceptually, if you have the amount of water in a watershed, namely the total annual precipitation. So that's the sum total of the available renewable water resources in that watershed. And so you would need to allocate it first to terrestrial ecosystems. So you'd have to account for the evapotranspiration. So this is the literal evaporation and transpiration of that water that isn't even usable because it goes back up into the ecosystems, into the sky. And then you have freshwater ecosystems, the in-stream flow requirements. So, for example, to support animals and plants. Then you have human consumption, a human right to water, and it's only when these have been allocated that you could even look at economic and social water allocation, and any individual facility would have an even smaller allocation than that. And this is obviously not to scale, because if there were, the yellow bit compared to the red bit, you'd only get like about 2.5 facilities in a watershed, and that's probably not quite accurate. But this is just for conceptual purposes of sort of looking at how do you allocate the responsibility for respecting a carrying capacity threshold at, say, an organizational level, for example. And so there's a number of different allocation methodologies that have emerged over time that this has been sort of applied. And 3 of them in particular would be physical, where you divvy up a resource based on an organization's productive use of it. So, if you're a cement maker, you have a certain percentage of the cement market, therefore you get this amount of responsibility for respecting the carrying capacity, not just of the cement, but the greenhouse gas emissions that the cement production releases. So a cement producer would have the responsibility, its fair share responsibility for those greenhouse gas emissions. And we'll share more about that momentarily. The other is per capita. So we're human beings, so you could compare an organization or a municipality, if you will, or a bioregion for that matter. You could compare its population to that of the reference community. So it could be a watershed, as I said, a bioregion, a state, a nation, or the entire world. So you're basically just trying to say, well, what of the overall population, what is the subset population, and use that equation or that quotient in order to get a percentage responsibility for an overall impact. The third would be economic allocation. So that's, if an organization or a region produces X amount of GDP, and this is all recognized that GDP is a horrible measure of well-being, but it is a mechanism, has ubiquitous data about it. So if you're just using it for allocation purposes, that is at least not as problematic as using it for a measure of well-being. Finally, the question of shared versus full. So if it's a shared resource, if it's a resource from the commons, for example, then there's a shared responsibility for managing the impacts on it sustainably. So managing the impacts within the carrying capacity. But there's also areas where, an individual, an organization, or a bioregion would have full responsibility. So it's not a shared resource; it's a resource that is fully in the responsibility of that particular entity. And so, for example, wages, a living wage, it is fully the organization that is employing the individual to pay them a living wage. That's not a responsibility that's shared elsewhere. It's fully of that organization. Or respect for human rights. That organization has full responsibility for respecting all human rights. It's not that's not an allocable, it's not a shareable responsibility, if you will. So this is from a report that I wrote for the United Nations about 5 years ago, and we'll come back to that shortly. In terms of applying this concept to the organizational context, that's something that was first articulated, applying carrying capacities to an organization in 2002 by the Global Reporting Initiative. And this is very much thanks to Ralph Thurm, who's my partner in r3.0, and he was with the Global Reporting Initiative at that time, and he oversaw the principles work stream that developed a set of principles that included sustainability context. And so sustainability context is there we go. Sustainability context is the idea that sustainability reporting, or even sustainability measurement, draws significant meaning from the larger context of how performance at the organizational level affects economic, environmental, and social capital formation and depletion at local, regional, or global levels. So simply reporting on or measuring the trend in individual performance or the efficiency of the organization leaves open the question of an organization's contribution to the total amount of these different types of capital or resources. And that bullet point is essentially Dana Meadows's means nothing to people. So the trend in individual performance or the efficiency doesn't tell us the total impact, if you will. So it's placing this information in the broader biophysical, social, and economic context lies at the heart of sustainability reporting, or sustainability measurement for that matter. So reporting organizations should consider their individual performance. So that's where the notion of an allocation is in there. Should consider their individual performance in the context of the limits and demands placed on economic, environmental, or social resources at the macro level. So it's this limits and demands where the idea of thresholds and carrying capacity comes into play. That's at the organizational level. A few years after the sustainability context principle came out, a colleague of ours, Mark McElroy, introduced what's called the sustainability quotient. And so for a little bit of background, Mark McElroy was the chair of Dana Meadows Sustainability Institute. That's the institute that she created in the late 80s or 90s with her MacArthur Genius Grant Award. And so he was chairing that until the time of Dana's premature death in 2001. And so their conversations were a lot about the idea of, well, we understand carrying capacity, we understand that it's being transgressed, but how do you apply that at these lower levels? And so that's what McElroy set forth to do in the wake of Dana's death, is translate these systems level carrying capacity measures to organizational or other subsystem levels, including, for today's purposes, the bioregional context. And so what the quotient says is that sustainability equals an actual impact, or the numeration, the numerator, the actual impact on the carrying capacities of vital capital resources over the normative impact, or the denominator. The denomination is sometimes what we call it. So in other words, what would the actual impact need to be in order to respect sustainability norms? And so to give a quick example of this, first, just the idea of capitals. Capital is just a synonym for resources. Most people think of it as financial capital, but there's a long history of literature of using the term capital in its much broader sense of a resource. And so you can see here, natural capital is resources that are created by Earth. And that as a subset of that are these anthropogenic capitals, or human created capitals. So social capital is the capital of networks. Human capital is resources that are for an individual. So like our knowledge would be human capital. Social capital would be networks using that knowledge together. Financial capital is what most of us are familiar with in the term. And manufactured capital or built capital would be taking natural capital like timber and transforming it into through human labor into a house, for example. So that's the notion of capital, the carrying capacities of the capital. So it's what McElroy is saying is that essentially these capitals, each capital has its own carrying capacity. There is an amount of a resource that that can sustain well-being, and that if we overdraw on that, that we are transgressing the carrying capacities. So this is taking the idea of carrying capacities and applying it to vital capital resources. And you can see, McElroy is introducing the notion of thresholds and allocations, or donuts and pies, if you will, to the idea of the carrying capacities of the capitals. So I won't go through all of this because I'll make these slides available after this. But the example I think that's an interesting one is that the carrying capacity of a hospital might be expressed in terms of staffed beds, while the carrying capacity of the climate system might be expressed in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide. So just a couple of examples, that last one there. So a carbon footprint is the term that has come to be used for just the actual emissions of greenhouse gases. So that would be the numerator in the sustainability quotient, is just the amount of actual carbon that is emitted by an entity or by all of us collectively. The carbon budget is a concept that emerged in the late 2000 aughts, of the amount of carbon or greenhouse gases that humanity can afford to emit before tipping the climate system out of balance and moving into dangerous territory climatically. So the carbon footprint is the actual amount of carbon. The carbon budget is the norm. That is the amount of carbon that can be released and still be relatively safe for our climate regulation system. Another example would be living wages. So the numerator would be the actual wage that's paid. The denominator would be what is the living wage amount. So if the actual wage paid is less than the living wage, then there is a gap there, and it is unsustainable, or it is not operating within its carrying capacity. So you see here where that was a maximum in the first instance, and this is a minimum amount. So it needs to be over the living wage amount, whereas the amount of carbon release needs to be under the carbon budget. Another example, this particular graphic was very popular during the COVID epidemic, which talked about healthcare system capacity. So this is a general graphic that essentially articulated the idea of carrying capacity. So a healthcare system has a certain capacity that it can exist within. McElroy used the notion of hospital beds, and if the health of the population worsens to the point where it transgresses the healthcare system capacity, then that's where we have the major problem that we experienced in COVID, which is without the protective measures, the wellness, or the illness, I guess I should say, of the population was greater than the carrying capacity of the healthcare system to provide for that population. That's just an example of something that all of us are quite familiar with. Last thing I'll say here in this idea of applying it at the organizational level is the Global Reporting Initiative called for the use of the sustainability context principle in 2002. There was a study done by Anders Bjorn that was released in 2017, and it looked at, well, how many companies are actually reporting on this sustainability context principle? And what they found is, of the 40,000 corporate responsibility reports that in the period that they were looking at, only 5% of them mentioned the idea of ecological limits. And it was just looking at ecological limits. It wasn't even looking at social limits. But only 5% of companies even referred to it. And then an even more infinitesimal amount, 31 of the 12,000 companies that were in the study universe, or 0.258%, disclosed that they actually took that mention of ecological limits and translated it, applied it to their performance assessment or their product design. So in essence, even though a dozen years of being required to apply this carrying capacity assessment passed, still companies were not doing this in 2017, and this hasn't really changed since then. Now, a few things that I think most of you will be familiar with, and then we'll bring it in particular to the bioregional context, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers. So we talk about the ecological thresholds, or ecological ceilings, they're sometimes called. The notion of planetary boundaries was introduced in 2009. You can see up in the upper left, where it assessed 7 of 9 different planetary boundaries. And as you can see, it found 3 of those to have been crossed, the ones that are in red. So climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle, all of those were assessed to be outside of their carrying capacity. When you fast forward to 2015, it was still 7 of those 9 boundaries were assessed, but they found that 4 of them had been crossed at this point. So land system change was the additional area that had transgressed the carrying capacity. Now we go down to 2023, so just last year, all 9 of the boundaries were assessed and 6 of them had been crossed. So additional crossings of carrying capacity were novel entities and freshwater change. And so now to the right, bottom right, 2024, this year, they've assessed all 9 boundaries and 6 of them have been crossed and 1 of them is nearly crossed. And that's ocean acidification. So we're into the danger zone for that. So what we can see here is that based on the scientific evidence, we are beyond carrying capacity for 6 of 9 of the Earth regeneration systems that we rely on for our ecological health. That's on the ecological side. On the social side, Kate Rayworth introduced the idea of the donut in 2012, which essentially was a graphic representation of the idea that we encountered earlier with the Kakayak Declaration that Kate Ward, not Kate Ward, Barbara Ward had introduced. The outer limits or ecological ceilings, as Kate Rayworth called them, and the inner limits or social foundations. So what Rayworth was saying is that we need to operate in the safe and just space for humanity, where we're not in overshoot, nor are we in undershoot or shortfall. And so in 2017, she published a study in The Lancet where she took the research that had been done at that point, the 2015 point, where the planetary boundaries research had showed that we were transgressing 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And then she looked at the evidence on the social side of things and found, as you can see, that all 12 social foundations were in undershoot or shortfall. So that means that the systems that we rely on for our well-being are all in hyper-stressed states right now. So what do we do about this? One example of what to do about it is work that we at r3.0 did with UNRIS, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, called the Sustainable Development Performance Indicators. And they framed this as measuring sustainability the authentic way. And so it was essentially inferring that if you're not assessing sustainability vis-a-vis carrying capacities, that is inauthentic, or that it's not going to get you to a sustainability, an actual assessment of sustainability. They pursued this because the SDG indicators showed that only a handful of the 231 SDG indicators actually contain thresholds. So there are 246 actually indicators. Some of them are repeats. So 231 of them are unique. And when we looked at them, we could only find just a handful. So a couple that referred to a poverty line, one around water that talked about the level of water stress, that the freshwater withdrawal is a proportion of available freshwater resources. Those have a threshold implied in them, but the remainders are all what Dana would say, meaningless. They don't have those thresholds baked into them. So that's why UNRISD embarked on this research project between 2018 and 2022. We were a project partner throughout that period. And I authored this concept note report in 2019 that essentially articulated a three-tiered typology, which was tier one was Dana's meaningless. So it was the numerator, it was the actual impacts that could show incremental movement in one direction or another, but not assess sustainability. So it's only when we get to tier two that we're adding the denominator. As you can see, it's referring to the sustainability quotient here, and resulting in full context-based indicators where the denominator takes into account the sustainability thresholds in ecological, social, and economic systems, as well as the allocations of those thresholds to organizations or other subsystem entities such as sectors, portfolios, or bioregional habitats. So we have the notion of a bioregion integrated directly into this UN report. And finally, the idea of activating transformation, that if our current systems are not operating within the carrying capacities, then what do we need to transform in order to get them to that respecting carrying capacity? And this is just we piloted these indicators with a bunch of organizations, big, huge organizations like Anglo American and Manulife that operate globally, as well as smaller social and solidarity economy organizations such as cooperatives like Cabot Creamery Cooperative, or the Indian Farm and Forestry Development Cooperative, or Van City, the financial cooperative in Canada, as well as large intermediaries such as the Impact Management Project, the World Bank, or the World Benchmarking Alliance. And finally, we also applied it at the city of Kitchener. So there was one municipality that was included in this research. So that was the piloting that essentially identified that all of these indicators were capable of being implemented across a variety of ecological, social, and economic impacts. And here is the manual that resulted, which, as you can see, it refers to it as authentic sustainability assessment. That these indicators, that's even got the dotted line here that is sort of a reference to a threshold. And then it has the sustainability quotient baked right into it. So that is available from the United Nations, and it's something that we've been working with, but it's applied at an organizational level in general. So the state of the art right now has not gotten to the point where it is applied broadly at a bioregional level. And that's where I want to end my inputs, is with a couple of different papers that have just come out from the Earth Commission. So the Earth Commission is a part of what's called the Global Commons Alliance. And the Global Commons Alliance is an initiative that is focused on applying these carrying capacity thresholds, or what they call Earth system boundaries. That's the terminology that they've come up with it, which essentially is the same as carrying capacity thresholds. And so the Earth Commission is a body of scientists, a group of scientists that are doing the scientific analysis of what these thresholds are, of what these Earth system boundaries are. And so this is a paper that was published in Nature Sustainability earlier this year, which talked about translating these Earth system boundaries for cities and businesses. And it has this box on a bioregional approach. And it said that applying this bioregionally is promising. The one thing that would need to be accounted for is that you'd need to take not just the bioregional perspective, but you would need to compare that to what they call a global citizens perspective. And they pointed out a few different ways that could be problematic if you just looked at the bioregional perspective and didn't put it into the broader context of a global citizen. So in yellow, you see here, it says a bioregional approach towards resource sharing rewards those with natural endowment, a country or a city located in a resource abundant region with a comparatively small population, while penalizing those located in water stressed regions or those with high population. That's one potential problem that would need to be resolved. This approach may also produce an unintended loophole, as the globally connected production and consumption system means a region can shift its environmental burden elsewhere. So, in other words, compensate for its high water consumption through embodied water without breaching its local boundary. So, in other words, it could import water from elsewhere, is what that sentence says. Similarly, a bioregional approach, their thing is inappropriate. I actually disagree with that, but it is an issue that would need to be resolved when it comes to sharing responsibilities. So regions that are rich in biodiversity are also often concentrated in the global south and often include territories owned and managed by indigenous communities. A bioregional approach in meeting the natural ecosystem area goal may place the entire burden on local communities and stakeholders, while the benefit is shared globally. In such a case, a globally shared responsibility, considering factors such as current needs and rights, historical responsibilities, and telecoupled system impacts, would be much more appropriate. So I agree that these are all things that would need to be taken into account. What I would say here in general, that the one area where I slightly disagree, at least with the nuance of this, is that any approach, so the approach for cities and the approach for businesses has all of these issues embedded in it. So anytime that you're allocating something down from a systemic level to a subsystem level, you're going to encounter these kinds of challenges. So this is by way of saying that these challenges have been addressed for cities and for businesses. And so we know pretty well what the problems are and how they can be addressed. And so the only thing that needs to be done is to apply those same kinds of solutions to the bioregional context. And so that's what I'm really, focusing on here, is that this has not really been done in bioregional contexts. And that's in many ways an opportunity for us in the design school and all of us who are looking at the bioregional focus going forward. So the last slide here is just a similar report that came, or paper that came out from the Earth Commission. This essentially says the same thing as the last one, just in a little bit more condensed format. But I really wanted to end here in terms of opening up to questions and answers about the concept of carrying capacities, but perhaps more importantly, a dialogue and exploration of ideas of how we could apply these concepts, these measurements and managements in a bioregional context, precisely because we know that we are overshooting or undershooting carrying capacity to such a dire level that addressing this at a bioregional scale is perhaps the most promising in terms of getting back into a sustainable and regenerative approach to living. So I'm going to stop my sharing there. And I saw that a couple things came in to the chat, but maybe I'll just open it up for questions and comments and dialogue while I'm going over and taking a look at what came in on the chat. And I'll see, one thing I'll say really quickly. So Elias noted that capital in French means also an asset. The term capital goes back to caput in the Latin roots of it, which means head. And it referred to a steer or cattle, where the head of the cattle was a type of resource, if you will. And so that's where it had the much broader sense of not just financial capital, but it had a broader sense of capital. So thank you for that, Elias. Did you want to say anything else about that, Elias, before we go over to Claire? Or just that brief comment? You're all set. Okay, great. So Claire, over to you for a question.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, really appreciated that, and actually just was feeling the need for a walkthrough of, because I know you've been posting about it. I just needed that overview. That's really helpful. I started to sometimes I just have to go to like actual examples that I'm thinking about to try and even get my head around what that can look like. And one of the things I was thinking about was we used to visit Lesotho, which is a tiny landlocked country in South Africa. And one of the things that was really prevalent there was the overgrazing that would lead to this incredible erosion of the landscape, like these massive erosion channels. We used to call them dongas. There was a whole cultural piece to that. There was also the degrading of the cultural systems that led to that. There was the system called lobola, which was when you got married, you needed to pay so many cattle to the wife's family for the exchange and the marriage. So your wealth was tied up in the amount of cattle. There was just so much stuff involved in that. But the erosion of the landscape meant that there was this breakdown at so many different levels, because anyway. But I'm sort of thinking, okay, so how do you even start to look at carrying capacity without looking at what is valued, what has been, what is no longer intact that helped keep that balance happening? How do people even relate to those very abstract numbers, which is what you were bringing up? And I know that's kind of a sort of an extreme example. It doesn't relate as much to North America, but to me, it holds some of the questions.
I think it absolutely relates to North America, Claire. If you don't mind, I think that the example that I started with from Lila June Johnston's dissertation was, and in particular the cycle of the bison, where the carrying capacity of the indigenous populations was intimately related to the number of bison and keeping a healthy herd of bison. And in fact, it was the burning of the cane brakes that created the corridors. So literally, the indigenous culture, and I say indigenous culture because this was knowledge that was created over generations of how to do that burning of a resource that otherwise would be used for food. So that burning of the resource, regenerated the soil. So that was one element of it that created both the passageways, but then also the food that the bison and buffalo were living on, that then were in that kind of dynamic relationship with the human. So I think that the example that you gave from Lesotho is very similar, in the sense that if you look at what white culture did in the United States, is that they literally killed the buffalo population, not because they were using it for food. They were doing it as a genocide, or some people would call an epistemicide, or the killing of an epistemology, or a way of understanding the world, or a way of being. And so I think you're absolutely right that pulling these threads apart is very difficult to do. And so the measurement is only, it's sort of like going back from a mechanistic, unrelated approach to try to cobble together sort of what the various different interrelated elements you would need to address in order to sort of get back into a sustainable relationship.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's so just to say, I think what was coming up for me was the need for the local engagement with communities. Sort of, I'm thinking like once you're starting to look at the land as a whole system, that you can start to even have those conversations about the relationship, like what makes sense to local people. And
Yes.
and then once there's some of that knowledge starting to be held, that the goals that you would like, the more abstract stuff that's happening at an organizational level, how do those two overlap? How do they inform each other? But there needs to be I think they're both useful, but one without the other is not useful as far as, yeah.
I fully agree with you, Claire. And in fact, another Claire in the bioregioning space, Claire Bradeur, was participated in the Global Thresholds and Allocations Network that we at r3.0 stewarded in 2022 and 2023. And one of the there were 3 work streams, and one of them Claire was on, that talked about the kind of rights holder or stakeholder engagement that is needed to underpin this. And so, yes, one could do many of these measurements without actually engaging, sort of hypothetically, but that's going to result in not getting a full picture. So as you're pointing out, you lose a sense of the knowledge, but also the priorities of those who are living in that particular region. So this is actually a piece of unfinished work. That work stream identified the need to have approaches to engaging rights holders, and particularly those who are most impacted by a transgression of carrying capacity. And right now, that isn't necessarily the case. That kind of in-depth stakeholder engagement is not. So the Earth Commission, for example, is not doing a ton of stakeholder engagement, and the corporate community, and generally speaking, isn't doing that as well. So I fully agree with you, and that's sort of part of what I'm hoping applying this in the bioregional context can start to flesh out those approaches. So thank you for that question and commentary, Claire. Carrie, I see that you've got a question, then Andrew and Ralph after that.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. My question is around, like, I'm trying to wrap my head around these numbers, and I think what would be helpful is like a contextual example. So I'm wondering if you've applied like these equations, for example, to a company like Walmart and compared it to like what their claims are versus like if you run these type of numbers, like, well, what does it really look like in terms of their sustainability agenda? And then I think what's also been proven is how fragile these global supply chains are with our changing climate. And so, like, I guess, is there an opportunity here for like corporations to co-opt this bioregional adaptation of such a way of approaching this to make their supply chains more efficient, but like to keep running the throughput that they're currently doing, which for Walmart is $600 billion a year of revenue, which is a lot of a lot of conversion of natural resources into called capital. So yeah, I know that's kind of a tangled question, but these are some of the thoughts that are running through my head, and I wonder if you can help me make sense of any of that.
Oh, it's a goodie. It's a good question. In part, as you and I have talked directly, we both have a history of working in the context of Walmart's sustainability efforts. So back in 2007, I authored their first sustainability report, And the short answer to your question is, at that time, at least, Walmart was not doing any of this. More recently, so in 2012, I sort of pointed out to the World Resources Institute, which is the steward of something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a methodology for measuring a corporate carbon footprint. And I'll just identify the irony here that the idea of footprint, as I noted earlier, came from the ecological footprint that had the threshold, the carrying capacity baked into the definition. And then when British Petroleum popularized the idea of a carbon footprint, they removed that threshold, the carrying capacity, from the definition. So now we've inherited the idea of a carbon footprint that only has the impact in it. It doesn't have the responsibility for respecting the carrying capacity baked into it. So in any case, that's in 2012, I pointed out the fact that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol didn't have these thresholds. They only enabled companies to do the measurement and not do the next necessary step. In other words, there's no reason to do this measurement unless you're going to manage those impacts sustainably. And so this resulted in the launching of an initiative, or not, my input wasn't the only thing that resulted in it, but it combined with other inputs to create something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so that's an initiative that now oversees the application of just these ideas to company contexts. But that gets to your next question, or at least part of your next question is, can this be gamed by sort of, or co-opted? And the answer is absolutely yes. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative itself has been co-opted in a number of different ways that I won't go into here. I have a long-standing complaint filed with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but the short headline version of it is that yes, Science-Based Targets Initiative was co-opted by the corporate community, and it created kind of loopholes, if you will. Now, in terms of the third element, or I guess the second element of your question around the global supply chains, so this is one of the primary reasons that I think there's value in pursuing the carrying capacity at a bioregional level. So first and foremost, I think that we who are sort of defining our lifeways in terms of the bioregional context, that there's value in just plain understanding and knowing the relative health or illness of the bioregion that we live in. So I think that there's value in and of itself. But also, if we take seriously Dana Meadows' notion of overshoot and collapse, the fact that we are overshooting 6 of 9 of planetary boundaries and all 12 social foundation thresholds means that we are operating in a state of protracted collapse. And therefore, the supply chains that are very fragile right now, as we experienced in COVID, those supply chains are not resilient to the kinds of collapse dynamics that are certainly going to be unfolding. And so there's a resilience. Ralph and I at r3.0 call it collapse resilience. So I see bioregional carrying capacity measurement and management as a core collapse resilience practice that is not only looking to enhance the resilience of that bioregion, but also looking to enhance the resilience of bioregions globally, where we might have to, identify and triage what supply chains do we really need to put our limited resources towards. So what resources really need to be supplied externally by supply chains, if that's even possible in the future, as compared to what resources do we really need to localize they may be available locally, but they're more expensive locally because of the perversity of the global economic system. So those are just some of the thinking. But Carrie, I think that your question leads to sort of a longer dialogue than we can have in the sort of remaining time here. So I'll leave it at that for now, and just go over to Andrew and then Ralph with the questions.
Hey, Bill, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
I guess just a practical question is, we obviously need to translate the global carrying capacity numbers down to a bioregional level. So I guess my question is, who's doing that work? And if is anybody doing that work, then I think it's ultimately going to fall on this community to lead that. And how do we actually make that happen?
So that's a great question. And I'd say, functionally speaking, the answer would be nobody. So I spoke to, and so the global numbers are available, and you could argue that actually some impacts are already more relevant at a less than global scale. So for example, water is really relevant only on a watershed scale. And so that kind of calculation is already happening at a watershed scale, although frankly, that is also a fairly labor and financial resource intensive process. So there are kind of workarounds, but that's just sort of a comment. Generally speaking, I think that many of the ecological impacts are globalized in scale. And so there's a need to do that sort of downscaling. So I've spoken with Mathis Wackernagel from the Global Footprint Network, who was the originator of the ecological footprint that I've been talking about. And I asked him, hey, are you guys doing this? And he said, no, the main reason that they don't is that data, the source data, so the numerator data, to use the sustainability quotient as an example, or as the context, that data generally doesn't exist on a bioregional scale. And think of it, so many of us, even defining the boundaries of the bioregions that we live in is an emergent practice. So many of us don't even live in a bioregion where we have, or at least I'll speak for myself, in the forest of the Northeast bioregion, we're still in the process of creating interorganizational coherence, I guess I would say. And we haven't gotten to the point where we are strictly defining those boundaries. And in fact, there are many instances where you don't need strict boundaries to pursue bioregioning, that you can pursue a bioregional approach without having those strict boundaries. But when it comes to measurement of impact, you do need to have fairly strict boundaries in order to delineate, well, where do we stop measuring this impact, and who do we hold accountable for managing those impacts sustainably. So I think that's the biggest obstacle right now, is in terms of both defining the bioregional boundaries and then having data that could measure the impacts according to those bioregional delineations. So, but I'd agree with you, Andrew. I think we are the ones we've been waiting for. It will largely be up to us to do this. There are, some allies that I think that we can work with on this, but I think that I'm not waiting around for others to solve this problem. I'm certainly moving forward myself. So thanks for that question, Andrew. Ralph, I see you've got a question.
Yeah.
Stephen next.
Thank you, Bill. A comment and a question. The comment is first to thank everybody to be on that call, just simply because the idea of thresholds and allocations for bioregions is an essential measurement of success that we will need to develop together. And Bill described the development of the UNSDPI, which was mainly done for corporations, for social and solidarity economies, for co-ops, and so on. And we did that in parallel because the ESG standards world was just not willing to take on that challenge, a challenge that, as Bill was explaining, was in the GRI guidelines since 2002, so for more than 20 years. And we had the hope that the UNSDPI would close that gap because we simply have done the homework for all of these standard setters. But what you now see with the degree of collapse that we're going into, with the difficulties that industries have, the appetite to really apply this or let standard setters adopt it and then apply it is actually going down. And that has very much also to do with the fact that if you apply this thresholds and allocations-based or context-based measurement, you would show your degree of unsustainability. And I just also wanted to respond to Carrie. She was asking about Walmart. There are now first raters and rankers who use companies' reports and then mirror them to the UNSDPI indicators. And they have now a list of over 1,000 companies that they analyzed. And it shows exactly that the degree of sustainability of these organizations is much, much lower than what they normally get from the MCIs and all of these other rating and ranking organizations that have black boxes in how they measure, they have black boxes how they create their ratings. And now there is for the first time, a really very transparent methodology that shows how unsustainable these organizations are. So what does that leave us with? There is lesser appetite in industries and at companies level to really apply this because there's so much under pressure. And even the ESG community is under pressure because it's all called woke. It's all called, it doesn't deliver anything, and rightly so. It doesn't deliver sustainability. It just delivers a documentation of our collapse. That's what ESG reporting does in the end. So we have to, and therefore it is so hugely important that the bioregional level understands what Bill was explaining, because it is, like I said, it is a measure of success of bioregions, and it will be a measure of success of how bioregions in the future will interact with each other. They will need that information. They will need that data because there are membranes between bioregions. And how are we going to govern and self-govern, and how are we going to have trade, and how are we going to have currencies if we don't have these thresholds and allocations-based data? So that was the remark that I wanted to make. Just because I think it is of utmost importance that we as the bioregional community pick up that challenge, because industries won't do it, governments won't do it, we have to do it. And the question that I have to Bill was, many of the municipalities, but also parts of bioregions are so attracted by the donut economics model and the donut, and it fits so well with the idea of carrying capacities of overshoot and undershoot and all of that. Still, when it comes to DEAL, the Donut Economic Actions Lab, you see that they are very hesitant in working with thresholds and allocations. And we are at r3.0 having contact with them for years now. And I just wanted you to give us, if you can, a little bit of an update of where that relationship sits, because you can't have donut economics without measurement.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. And so Ralph is referring to a couple of years back, the Donut Economics Action Lab released a no company donuts policy, which struck us as odd, seeing as the one entity on earth that is most responsible for transgressing the donut thresholds is the business community, the corporate impact. So, no company donuts didn't make sense. I think they did it because of Carrie mentioned sort of the danger of gaming the system. But from our perspective, well, you know, by just throwing the entire system out for fear of gaming the system seems to be not the best approach. So we've been in direct dialogue with the Donut Economics Action Lab for 2 years. We're partnering with them on exploring this context-based sustainability approach in the municipality setting. We're actively in a research project right now that's funded by the Canadian federal government. And so we're in good collaborative relationship, but not so good that they have rescinded their no company donuts policy. And I'm glad to talk about that in more depth in the future, but I see we've just got a little bit of time left. And Penny, you've got your hand up, and Stephen, you had your hand up earlier. Do you want to, Penny, go first, and we'll check in if Stephen still has a question.
Thanks, Bill. This has been fantastic. My question is, so if we're the ones who are going to help do this, what do you feel is the next step for the next step where we could get involved, and where are you working on this now, and how can we help?
That's a really great question, Penny. So we have basically drafted a proposal for a research project that would look at essentially identifying a methodology for measuring and managing bioregional carrying capacity, and then piloting that. So what we would need is a few things. One is we're looking for funding to support that. And then we would also need bioregions that would be, raise their hand to volunteer to do the piloting of that methodology. So I'll share in the sidebar here. We have whoops, I need to go out of the view. We have a proposal, and so here I will put it right here. So this is the proposal that we have drafted, and we've shared it with the Global Commons Alliance and are waiting to hear back from them. But we would gladly move forward on this with sufficient funding to do it. So that's the other thing that I think would be helpful, is funding this particular project would help it get rolling. So thank you for that question, Penny. That's sort of the answer in a nutshell. And I see we're at time. I'm able to stay on just a little bit more in case you had a question. Stephen, I know your hand was up earlier. Did you still have a question?
No, it was a follow-on to Andrew's question, and I think I'm going to do some poking around to see if any of the local universities here in the GTB have actually sort of quantified the carrying capacity for Southern Ontario. I'm sure we've got some really good university programs here, and I'm sure there must have been some work done at that. So it was just a logical follow-on from Andrew's question.
And that's great. And in fact, Andrew introduced us. Andrew had met a gentleman from York University, where they're doing the ecological footprint data analysis, data compilation and analysis. And so Andrew introduced me, I responded, and we haven't heard back yet, but I'm hopeful that might be a resource. But Stephen, any work that you could do towards that would be super duper appreciated. Cool. So if there aren't any more questions, I guess the one thing that I would say is, I said at the beginning, this is something that we could do. We could have a series of these dialogues. One next step could be looking at the municipality context, because it is within the bioregional. It's obviously nested within the bioregional scale, and we're doing some very specific work on this and could give examples of that work. In particularly, we've worked with the city of Nanaimo in British Columbia and have shared that example, pretty broadly already. So that's one place that we could go, but maybe I'll look to the Mighty Networks platform and engagement there to just assess the interest in sort of a next version of this and a series where we could look at this more in depth together. So I'll leave it there, and if folks need to drop off, that's great. Claire, I see you've got a question, but first, Penny, I don't know if if you've got time constraints in terms of this line that we're on.
No, that's all right. We can continue with Claire. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm kind of going back to, I've been for years, I've been part of conversations with our local municipality, in particular, a group called One Planet Saanich. It was one of the, and Cora Holsworth has, she did her training with Bill Reed and doing the ecological footprint. She's really, well known for that in British Columbia, and I think past. And I think sort of as we've kind of got into the nitty gritty of those, of like looking at those numbers, the thing that always struck me was that they're based on existing patterns of consumption and really not looking at like I look at the society, the society and just the level of degradation as being able to work together as a community and even sort of coordinate itself so that we're doing things that are in relationship to the local conditions that are happening. There's a sort of happening of that, but it's very kind of it just doesn't feel very it's not something that I feel a lot of confidence in, just the way that happens. Yes, there's local inputs that are sort of affect decision making and what have you, but it's just, when I think about really deeply understanding, when we think about the coherence of the land and how that maps to it or tracks to it, it just often feels very disconnected. And so what I wanted to kind of just bring up is that I've kind of noticed how the questions they're asking they make sense in a certain kind of way, and they also make no sense in other ways. And they're also based on this foundation of, like, I think, social breakdown. So that, what we're getting in terms of the data that's being represented, it's sort of useful, but it's also, there's a lot of stuff that it just doesn't feel useful for. I know I already brought that up, but I just wanted to say that what I would find myself happening is I'd actually end up having really fantastic side conversations with many of the Indigenous folk who were involved with that, because they were bringing up the same concerns and then not wanting to even participate because it was like we weren't asking the questions that needed to be asked, weren't there. I just wanted to bring that up as a real world example of the frustration of the fact that the conditions for asking those questions just aren't there, I feel. And that's, to me, that is the work that's really needed, is to create those containers where that real place-based knowledge systems are being brought into like that shared context. Like to me, that is like, to me, it's always been quite remarkable that there hasn't been more focus on that. I did notice the MIT, Otter Sharma's, what do they call that? The U Lab, them asking, and sort of in a recent talk, maybe in the last 6 months or a year, where they were saying actually the area that we need to focus on most is, he was describing that this is the area that there needs to be a lot more work in it. So I was like, wow, that's fantastic to hear that being named, but I don't see a lot of that work happening besides in the bioregional sphere.
Yeah, so Claire, I think what you're bringing up is fundamentally important, and it's something that I see as well. And so I guess one thing I'd say is, um, uh, I guess you could go back to the term sustainability didn't enter the lexicon until 1713. Like that's the first instance that we see the term sustainability, and my interpretation of that is that you don't need the concept of sustainability until you are unsustainable, until you're doing things that are inherently unsustainable. So essentially, although it's the term sustainability, it's really the concept of unsustainability that entered our consciousness. And so similar with the idea of carrying capacity. So I'd say that part of what I hear you saying is the ultimate goal, or you could call it sort of the third horizon goal, is to make all of this absolutely obsolete. Like, I wish that I didn't have to be focusing on carrying capacity at all. I wish that we existed in cultures that didn't systematically transgress carrying capacity. So in some ways, exploring this is kind of it's an H2 plus in Three Horizons language. So it's basically recognizing that the existing system is broken. Therefore, we have to engage to some degree in a kind of what Carol Sanford would call arrest disorder. So if there is disorder, we need to stop that. But I think Carol, who recently passed away, and so blessings on Carol's sort of ongoing existence in our world through all of us, continuing to sort of live through her spirit. I think that she would talk about needing to take a fully regenerative approach while also not ignoring the problems that the existing system has created. So I think I would agree with you that I don't think that we can just focus on the arrest disorder practice of measuring carrying capacity transgressions. We have to couple that with visioning the resolution of that problem by embracing ways that don't transgress this altogether. It's just that in the transition from here to there, knowing where we need to put most of our energy is important. So for one example that helps to illustrate that is that, you know, a company that a colleague of mine, Mark McElroy, who I mentioned earlier, was working with Biogen, which is a pharmaceutical company, and they were operating in North Carolina, and the municipality was going to require them to reduce their water use. And they're like, well, actually, we're monitoring our water use, and we know for a fact that we're not using more than our fair share. So if you have water problems, it's from somebody besides us. And the point here is that they were able to demonstrate that they were not using more than their fair share of water, and therefore they were able to take the resources that they would have put towards reducing their water use when they didn't need to reduce their water use. In other words, they weren't the cause of the problem, and apply that elsewhere where they were more greatly transgressing their problem. So that's just one example of, you know, we may be chasing the wrong problem if we don't know clearly what the problem is and what our status on that is. So I hope that helps. But Claire, I'm very much on board with you know, my impatience for getting out of H2 plus and into H3. But that's, unfortunately, we're living in an H1 world. So, and I see that John has a hand up. I'll continue answering questions as long as we can stay here for the line is open, or at least until I run out of energy and need to eat. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Claire was saying, and something also to do with the E4A, Earth for All. So in Britain,
Yes.
in Northern Europe, we've been doing a lot of work with donut economics, Amsterdam, Copenhagen. We've done quite a lot in Oxfordshire as well. Just finished it actually. There's a particularly good one in Birmingham, which is the second city after London, because what they've done, and Cornwall, in both cases, what they've done is not even use the term donut economics. They've used it as a lens through which to identify carrying capacity and overshoot. But in neither case, in Cornwall, for instance, the government have developed their own decision wheel, is what they're calling it. They're not calling it donut economics anything. It's a decision wheel that is deployed within government in order to address the next infrastructure problem or community problem that comes up. In Birmingham, it's really interesting because where they've gone into numerous meetings without mentioning anything to do with donut economics, and they've listened and they've wanted to find out where the problems are being identified by the community. Then they come back a week or so later, and then they suggest that they've got a solution, again without even describing that donut economics is the means by which they identified and measured the carrying capacity in whatever particular context that was. So I think with the California, with CalDEC, I think it's quite an interesting opportunity to integrate that particular approach also, without wanting to go down the let's all adopt the top-down focus from government and donut. The second point I wanted to make, or ask you actually rather, Bill, is that you're talking about the various frameworks and carrying capacity. We're looking at the Earth for All framework, which is a Club of Rome, and it's a way to, I'm interested in it because it's a way to integrate the various SDGs in one framework. So I wonder whether that's what we're looking at, how to use that in a regional context within Northern Europe. And I'm curious whether that's something that you've looked at yourself. And if not, that's a discussion I think would be quite interesting to have, because Germany have looked at using it in several other countries, but not that many more. But because it follows out of the Club of Rome agenda, and Scandinavia has used it as well.
Yeah, thank you, John. Two really good points. The first one I'd say that is a dynamic that I recognize all too well, which is what I call the need for linguistic gymnastics, which is essentially that you realize that if you're using certain language, another example of this would be using the term collapse. So I feel fairly comfortable using it here because I know that this community tends to be collapse aware. But in other communities, so in the town that I live in, I wouldn't start the conversation with collapse. Because that would, there's an emotional response that people have to that you have to navigate through that emotional response before you can really engage productively with the reality of collapse. And so that's a sort of a similar example where I would use other language to get to the point where I would then be able to talk with the more precise language. So I recognize that there are instances where, not using the term donut, or not using the term sustainability, or not using the term carrying capacity, that sort of avoiding the complexity, but also the psychological cognitive dissonance that might introduce could be useful. So I'm with you on that front. The one thing that I am concerned about is when that then becomes an avoidance, that perpetuates avoidance. And so I only tolerate that kind of linguistic shifting until the point of actually looking at what measurements are being used and what analysis is being applied. And so in instances, if you can circumnavigate the language but still do a precise analysis, then I'm all on board. But if that linguistic hesitancy translates into analytic hesitancy, that's when I'm concerned. And I think that's part of what we're seeing with the Donut Economics Action Lab, is that they're doing incredible work, and so we're partnering with them on the one hand, but we're also, trying to continue to encourage them to understand the methodologies that have predated them and that, go back to Dana Meadows herself, that their approach is sidestepping the ability to use these sort of time-tested and well-pedigreed approaches. In terms of Earth for All, so we know that work well. It shares some lineage with the planetary boundaries work. And in fact, our last conference, the r3.0 conference this year, we had Jayati Ghosh from the University of Massachusetts here in my neck of the woods, who was one of the lead authors of the Earth for All book, speak at our conference. And so, we have lines of communication with Earth for All. We, generally speaking, embrace their approach. It's very similar to the approaches that we would take. I guess the one thing that I would say is an interesting dynamic is that, Earth for All, Planetary Boundaries, Donut Economics Action Lab, all of these have much more visibility than some of the approaches that predate these initiatives. And for whatever reason, they've been reluctant, even though the approaches that we use, again, date back. They have their lineage back to Dana Meadows, but they're not employed for reasons I can't fully understand. And so I think that I'm eager to have the bioregional context embrace the most robust approaches possible, and do sort of get it right from the beginning instead of having to reverse engineer. So anyway, that's my thoughts on what you've been saying. And John, I will post either here, if I can get to it, or on the Mighty Networks, a link to our the work that we're doing with municipalities on sort of municipalities that have tried the SDGs or the Donut Economics Action Lab approach and are looking to work with the more robust context-based sustainability approach. So we're doing a research project on that right now. And so if you're aware of municipalities who are doing that kind of work and would want to explore that, I would I'd be glad to share that document with you.
That's good. We have 6 large cities in Northern Europe, Bill. So yes, absolutely. That's really
okay.
Good.
Cool. I'll share that with you, John.
Great. Thank you. Cool.
I think I'm starting to get hungry. It's nearing lunchtime here, so we're a good 20 minutes over. Penny, thank you for keeping the recording going and staying on the line. Thanks to everyone for that. And I think, why don't we call it a day here and look to assess the interest in continuing this series on. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See ya.